So you want readers, do you? Well, then you're just going to have to write them into existence. Welcome back, friends. If you spend much time talking about rhetoric, you'll quickly learn that most roads lead to your audience. I mean, your audience is kind of the whole point. If you're doing something persuasive, obviously you want your audience to listen so they'll do the thing you want them to do. And if you're writing a poem or something, you still want people to read your work. Well, yeah, unless a person writes for themselves, but for many writers, sharing their work is a goal, whether that's in the form of publication or just reading a poem to a loved one at home. Often, as we've seen before, writing for oneself can also just be part of a writer's development, a solipsistic phase where a maturing writer is overly enamored of their own work, to the alienation of potential readers. So, as writers move through their growth, they often arrive at the point where they want readers, and then the challenge is getting them. But since all rhetorical roads flow towards audience, we're in no shortage of rhetorical theory that can help us to think through our strategy for finding and attracting an audience. And today, I'm especially interested in talking about the idea that you're not just finding your audience and appealing to them, but that you can, through your writing, create your audience. So, how about that? During the 1980s, scholars of rhetoric were developing a new approach to rhetoric and audiences, which James Boyd White called constitutive rhetoric. And really, the basic idea is that forms of discourse can constitute or create audiences based on a shared sense of identity. That is, we can use language, symbols, and other rhetorical tools to recruit people to identify with a collective audience. And that's some abstract stuff, and it's about to get worse, but stick with me because this is actually pretty cool. In a 1987 issue of the Quarterly Journal of Speech, an influential article examined the ways in which a political movement in Canada, specifically Quebec in the 60s and 70s, brought the term Québécois into the mainstream, in contrast to the then current term French Canadian. Now, as is so often the case with scholarship in rhetoric, there's a lot of analysis of specific discourse and documents in the article, and frankly, it's less important to understand the ins and outs of 20th century Canadian politics, at least for our purposes, than to understand the role that rhetoric played in reframing and even creating a Québécois political identity. Early in the piece, though, we see a description of the work that constitutive rhetoric does in terms of our perennial rhetorical friends, the Athenians. We should ask, the author writes, how those in Athens come to experience themselves as Athenians. Indeed, a rhetoric to Athenians in praise of Athens would be relatively insignificant compared to a rhetoric that constitutes Athenians as such. In other words, it's much less interesting to think about the kind of discourse that appeals to Athenians than it is to think about the kind of discourse that causes Athenians to think of themselves as Athenians. Before you can feel proud of your Athenian identity, you have to be led to adopt a sense of Athenian identity, and the rhetorical influences that accomplish that are as interesting and powerful as they can be subtle. Of course, when we're talking about identity, I bet the only thing you can think of is the biggest friend of the show, name of Kenneth Burke, who proposed the notion of identification as an alternative to the traditional focus on persuasion in rhetorical discourse. And we've talked about this before, but the short version is that persuasion-oriented rhetoric is focused on getting someone to do something. Identification-focused rhetoric is more interested in the formation and mediation of identities. And Burke makes an example of the politician who tells an audience of farmers, "I was a farm boy myself," in order to illustrate the point. Before motivating those farmers to vote for him, the politician attempts to get the farmers to identify with him, to highlight their shared sense of identity. And this is basically what constitutive rhetoric does too. It operates on shared identity. But it's not just about finding shared identities, it's about creating them. So not just connecting with Athenians, but creating the very idea of being Athenian. So all this means that certain forms of discourse can actually create audiences. It's a process of creating points of identification and then recruiting individuals to identify as part of the audience. As the scholar Sarah R. Stein later put it, audiences are not considered to exist outside rhetoric as the subjects of its address, but rather to live inside the rhetoric that constructs them. From that perspective, discourse isn't just directed at an audience, it creates it. And we could go deep into the theoretical complexities of this issue, but who's got the time? But for as much as this constitutive rhetoric business is abstruse, it's also something we see all the time, especially on a platform like YouTube. You will have seen, for example, how a content creator begins making videos that then begin to attract an audience of people who share an interest in the subject matter and personality of the creator. Over time, those regular viewers become a community with shared in-jokes, common points of reference, and maybe even a silly name. You might also see branded merchandise that then becomes a symbol of identity and a signal to others IRL of shared participation in the community. And an audience like that is not one that existed out there in the world and then the creator just figured out how to address them. An audience like that is created through the various rhetorical influences of videos, community posts, comments, merch, and more. All of those become markers of an identity and ways of defining an audience and community that didn't and couldn't exist independent of the discourse. So see, it's really easy. So with that crash course in constitutive rhetoric under our belts, what do we do with this knowledge? What does this actually mean for us as writers? Well, I think the real lesson is that you are in a position to create your audience, and the way that you write is your primary tool for recruiting members to that audience. For example, this show is one that does have a goal of helping people learn new things about writing, but it also has other significant goals, like repairing attitudes about writing and building a community of good and good-natured writers, among others. And sometimes people run into the channel with misplaced expectations that lead to a misunderstanding of what's going on. If this show were the kind that just offered helpful tips for people on a sort of one-off basis, maybe like the ones that you look up to fix your faucet once or change a light on your car and then never go back to, there's an argument to be made that certain aspects of the show are merely distracting. Where a one-off tutorial isn't looking to build an audience, anything beyond the most straightforward presentation of bare information is probably unnecessary. But that isn't the goal. If I'm trying, yes, to help people with their writing, but also to communicate the cool things that my discipline does that have mostly been stuck in the academy, and to build a community that's interested in writing and rhetoric, then there are other rhetorical tools at work beyond just a transactional release of information. So a glittery skull on a shelf might be a distraction in one sense, but it might also serve a well-defined rhetorical purpose in another. It's a tool for recruiting an audience, and over the years, the positive response has outweighed the negative in both quantity and quality. Well, that's one way to think about it, but really, the idea is that including an element that affects the tone and character of the show is something that also serves to constitute the audience of the show. It's a common reference point and a key element of the identity of the Writing with Andrew audience. But this can play out in our writing in other ways too. For example, I once had a student whose writing was fascinating, linguistically interesting, and almost totally inscrutable. There was a certain pleasure in reading their work, but it was also not going to do anything to help you to understand what it had to say. On a couple of occasions, when we met to talk about their work, we talked about how that approach to writing, while not inherently bad, was also not without its consequences. There are no neutral choices, as rhetoricians are fond of saying, and the choice to write difficult, obscure, even opaque texts is a choice that has implications for the audiences those texts can recruit. And there are people who want to read obscurantist poetry and out there academic theory, but it's a smaller group of people than the ones who are willing to sign up to read accessible poetry and familiar stories. You're allowed to write things with a very niche appeal, but then don't be surprised or bothered when that work ends up constituting a very niche audience. The way that you write in large part determines the audience your work will create. Your approach to writing signals to your writers who you expect them to be, or the identity that you're inviting them to adopt, at least for as long as they're reading. So what signals are you sending to your readers? What audience are you trying to create? As Lisa Eade and Andrea Lunsford put it, writers may analyze these readers' needs, anticipate their biases, even defer to their wishes. But it is only through the text, through language, that writers embody or give life to their conception of the reader. In so doing, they do not so much create a role for the reader as invoke it. Writers conjure their vision, a vision they hope readers will actively come to share as they read the text, by using all the resources of language available to them to establish a broad and ideally coherent range of cues for the reader. So of course you're allowed to write sprawling sentences full of academic jargon, but then don't be surprised when you build an audience of self-congratulatory academics. You're allowed to write poems about raising cattle for beef, but then don't be surprised when you don't have many vegetarian readers. And you can adopt a self-flattering stance in your memoir, but then don't be surprised when the readers looking for human vulnerability end up going elsewhere. So spend some time thinking about the audience that you want to create. What do they value? What turns them away? What do they like reading? And then, how can you write so that you call out the right audience, recruiting them to identify with both you and your work? Of course, there isn't a single correct answer to any of those questions, but any thoughtful writer ought to have some way of answering them. So, my friends, it may just be that you have more power than you think when it comes to finding an audience for your work. Ultimately, the way you write can do a lot to create an audience for your writing. That means that you're in a position to think about the kind of audience you want to create, and then to shape your work to appeal to and reinforce the sense of identity that your readers will have as readers of your work. And speaking of creating audiences, I've become more and more pleased with the community we've been building together. You're a bunch of lovely people, and I'm grateful that you've decided to stop by and that you keep coming back. As an aside, if you haven't yet joined us on Discord, you're really missing out. There are lots of interesting writing discussions going on, including the ever-engaging question of the day, brought to us by our capable and inquisitive moderator. The link is in the description. Now, get out there and write some things that will constitute your dream audience. Thanks again for joining me today, and I will catch you in the next one.